let's continue on with chapter 6, section 6.4. So now we're going to be comparing other countries. So now that we know that GDP is the total value of all final goods and services, that's going on in all the different countries. However, in almost all the different countries, they have a different currency. So basically, it's really hard to compare $2 trillion in United States dollars to, 50 million trillion uh, of Zimbabwe dollars. All right, so it's really hard to see, like, well, are they the same? Are they different? Does one have more production than the other? So that's why we have the exchange rate. The exchange rate is basically going to take that currency in another country, let's say Brazil, and it's going to exchange it to where, if that was in US dollars, how much would that be? Okay. So to compare the GDP of different countries with different currencies, it is necessary to convert to a common denominator using the exchange rate. So basically, since we know what the US dollar is, we can just translate that Brazilian real into United States dollars, so that way we know how much GDP Brazil has. So the exchange rate is just the value of the price of one currency in terms of another currency. Basically, it's just like the worth of a dollar in terms of a real. Later on in the semester, we're actually going to be looking at how this could change, okay? But the main thing I really want you to understand right now is that this is how you have to compare other countries, by using the exchange rate, okay? So all you're going to do is you would look up what is the exchange rate between the United States dollar and the real, and then it would give you a number. So here, 2.362 reals for every dollar. So for every single dollar that you have, that is the same as 2.362 reals. Okay? So basically, once we have the exchange rate, we just take the GDP divided by the exchange rate, and that'll give us the GDP for Brazil in US dollars. Okay, so here we go. So the Brazil's GDP in US dollars is $3.1 trillion. So now let's take that and compare it with the United States. Okay, so 7.4 million reals is equal to $3.1 trillion. And if we were to compare this to the US GDP was 20.9 trillion in 2020. So basically, it was almost 7 times as larger than Brazil. Okay, so that's the whole point of the exchange rate, is because it's really hard to tell which one's greater or not, because we don't know the value of the real in terms of dollars. But now we do. You use the exchange rate. Okay, so the main thing I really want to understand now is just we use the exchange rate to compare other countries. Now, if we were to continue on, here's some more examples. So if we were to look at Canada, for example, this is their GDP in their dollars, and we have the exchange rate here. Okay, PPP means purchasing power parity. Basically, that's the exchange rate. It's just basically how much is the value of the Canadian dollar to the US dollar buying the same stuff. So basically, a Big Mac, for example, would cost $4 in here, or it might cost, 5.2 Canadian dollars. Same good, but different prices. So that's the purchasing power parity equivalent. Okay? So it's just the exchange rate. So once we have that, we can then find the GDP in the US dollars. Okay? And now we can compare all of these countries to each other and to the United States. That way we can see which one's larger, which one's, growing, things like that. The exchange rate is very, very important, so we understand how big or how much production a country is doing. Okay, I mean, look at South Korea, right? That could be really confusing. That could be like a really big GDP, but once we put it into US dollars, right, it's only 2 trillion. Okay? So the United States dollar is so the United States exchange rate here is fantastic in the sense of comparing other countries. So as you can see here, China is number 1 in terms of GDP on this chart. The United States is number 2. because right here, this is China, this is the United States. So China does have 24 trillion US dollars in GDP, and the US only has 20.9 trillion. All right, so that's how we compare other countries, is by using the exchange rate. Now, going off of that, we're going to add in GDP per capita, because yes, it is very nice to know what is the total production for your country. Okay, that's really good. But what we also want to know is like how much is that production is for every person. How productive is every person in your economy? That's what we want to know next. GDP per capita is basically showing you how much production does one person do. So the U.S. economy has the largest GDP in the world, and we're pretty populous as well. But is its economy also larger on a per person basis? Okay, so look at China, right? Very large GDP. Well, what's their GDP per capita? Like, what's their output per person? And how we can do that is take the GDP and divide it by the population. Okay, so all you're going to do, GDP divided by the population. This is going to give you, like, if everybody made t-shirts, okay, and we had a GDP of $1 million, okay, well, how many t-shirts is each person making? Okay, so we would take the $1 million and divide it by how many people are making them. So we would find the average amount of production each person is doing. Same deal here. Just take the GDP divided by the population, and that will give you the GDP per capita. This is going to tell you how productive each person is, and it's going to reveal very important information. Because now we can basically see if we have a high income nation or a low income nation. All right, because remember, how productive you are really determines your income. And if your people are really, really productive, then they are producing a lot of things and have a high income, and that's going to lead to a higher standard of living. So here, if we were using the same countries as before, okay, where China was number 1 and the United States was number 2, what is the GDP per capita? So we have China here, okay, and their GDP per capita is $17,000. So that means every person on average in China produces $17,000 worth of goods and services. The United States, on the other hand, has 63,000. Okay, so now on average, they are having the average person producing $63,000 worth of goods and services. So right there, if we were to just look this as an income standpoint, right, the United States would be number 1, and then China would be somewhere in the middle. Okay, so this means that the well-being per person is completely different. So if you were just looking at GDP, you would say, okay, China is the largest. If you were to look at GDP per capita, which is how productive each person is, then you would see there is a big difference there. Okay, like the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and Japan, they have a GDP per capita in between 20,000 and 50,000. So those countries are what we call high income nations. Okay, so these are really productive countries. They maybe have really good education for everybody. They have maybe a higher standard of living. Middle income nations like Latin America, Eastern Europe, and some countries in East Asia are going to fall into the $6,000, $12,000 per capita range. Those are the middle income. And then anything low income nation will be less than $2,000. So very, very low production per person. Okay. So GDP is very nice to know, but GDP per capita is that extra step in trying to see how productive is your country in terms of people. Remember, all we do is GDP divided by population. Now, I mentioned GDP as showing you like a standard of living, well-being, but if we were to look at GDP, okay, remember GDP is the total value of all the production of goods and services, all the goods and services produced, okay? But if we're just producing goods and services, well, that doesn't give us like the quality of the goods. It doesn't give us like Our happiness, right? It doesn't measure that. It just measures how much stuff you're producing. So, in terms of standard of living, which is all the elements that affect a person's happiness and well-being, whether they're bought and sold in the market or not, okay? That's the standard of living. GDP only measures the production. It doesn't measure everything else. So in terms of standard of living, it is really, really hard to just say, oh, high GDP, high standard of living. And the issue here is because GDP does not include a couple things. Two countries could have equal GDP, and one nation's workers may have an average workday of 8 hours a day, while the other country has an average workday of 12 hours. Okay, so same production, right, in terms of numbers, GDP. Okay, maybe GDP per capita could be the same too. But if we were to look at happiness in terms of working 8 hours a day or 12 hours a day, big difference there, right? There might be more happiness with the 8 hours a day than the 12 hours a day. So same numbers, but different standards of living. The average US worker works several hundred hours more per year than the average German worker. And calculating GDP does not account for the German worker's extra vacation weeks. Okay, so again, there's that level of happiness that GDP is just not able to calculate. Because GDP does not include leisure time. This is the time away from work. I like to call this time watching TV for sure. Okay, if I'm not working, I'm watching TV. Okay, that's my leisure time. The GDP does not include any actual levels of environmental cleanliness, health, or learning. So basically, we have no idea the cleanliness of the environment. You could have a very, very great GDP. You can produce a ton of things, but have a terrible, terrible pollution problem, terrible water, right? And your country is not a safe place to live. And we'll never know that based off of GDP. You look great in terms of production, but you have terrible pollution problems. Production that is not exchanged in the market, some of the under the table or cash transactions. So basically what's happening here is that you have to, buy a service. And if, you're just mowing lawns in the neighborhood, that's a great thing. And some people will pay you cash for that. And, the government doesn't know about that cash transaction there. So is this happening in the country? Yes, but it's not measured under GDP. All right. The level of inequality in society. So GDP, total production, right? So we could have one person that has all the income, does all the production, and we have another person that absolutely does nothing. But we have no idea that level of inequality that's going on. What if we had, in terms of GDP per capita, we have the average person producing $60,000 worth of stuff? But what if they're doing the exact same production, but they're paid different amounts? GDP does not measure that. Last one, what technology and products are available? Okay, so basically, in terms of trying to compare different countries, right, we do have the exchange rate, but we also don't have a way of exchanging the technology. So basically, different countries do things different. Different countries do things well because of what they have. And GDP is not going to be able to tell you, in terms of comparing other countries, what they have to make y'all kind of like on the same playing field. So these are the main things that GDP does not include. So therefore, there is not a single number that can measure the very broad term of standard of living. So if anybody tells you, hey, they have a good GDP per capita, that means it's a great place to live, stop them right there. Is that one indicator you can use? Yes. Are there tons of other indicators you can use? Yes. You could look at the unemployment rate. You can look at the inflation rate. You can look at the crime rate. You can look at the amount of work, the average working hours per person. You could look at the total benefits from working. Okay. You can look at all these different indicators to see what is the standard of living. There's not one number that will be able to do this. Okay. So in the next one, we'll talk about chapter 7, which is economic growth. I'll see you there.